Pleasure to welcome all of you, and also a real pleasure to welcome the Partnership for the Historic Bostons launching their lecture series here. And they'll be going to other interesting venues, the Boston Public Library, the Old South Meeting House, as well as meeting online in the comfort of your own homes. And the partnership really commemorates the events of a September 394 years ago, when the folks who had come, 1,200 or so who arrived that summer and were spread from Dorchester, Roxbury, Watertown, Newtown, Charlestown, settled on the Shawmut Peninsula to be the shire town for what would become the Massachusetts Bay Province. Really a phenomenal event, and they decided also to name this settlement Boston in honor of Boston in Lincolnshire, which was the seat of the Reverend John Cotton's church, St. Botolph's Church. And 25 years ago, the partnership of the historic Bostons began to commemorate the links between these two communities, as well as to commemorate the 17th century world in which they were together, and the many, many influences that endure from that long, distant time. In addition to deciding that Boston would be the shire town, they also decided on how they would be governed, and that's really the theme of this year's series. Tyranny versus liberty. They were forming a civil body politic where these disparate elements would be knit together as one man, and where the governed would be the governors, and the governors would return among the governed at the end of their terms. And they were working out their common destiny, which would be resolved through disagreement, election, argument. Still a very radical decision they made, which we are still wrestling with today. And this evening's first lecturer is David Hall. I won't tell you more about David Hall. He will be properly introduced, but he will be talking about the radical ways the Puritans who arrived here in Massachusetts Bay departed from the standard way of governing. That is, the Puritan Revolution here in Massachusetts was not just a religious revolution, but a political and social revolution, as they were rejecting the ideas of arbitrary rule and of royal prerogative. So it promises to be a very exciting series of talks exploring the 17th century world as the Partnership for the Historic Bostons continues to follow its mission of allowing us to see history and present history and the world, not as we would hope it might have been, or wish it might have been, or know that it was inherently wrong, but instead presenting history really clearly and as it was. So I want to welcome all of you to Suffolk and for the inauguration of the Partnership for the Historic Bostons lecture series on tyranny versus liberty. So thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone, and let me just add my welcome to Bob's. I'm Lori Rogers-Stokes with the Partnership of Historic Bostons. And I will do two things, tell you how we will run the show tonight and introduce David Hall. So tonight, David will come up, he will give his talk, we will hold questions until the end. Now, we have many people joining us online, as well as many people here in the room tonight. If you're online, and you have a question at any point, and I guess the same goes for you all here, a question at any point, 5 minutes in, 8 minutes in, put it in the chat if you're online, write it down if you're here. We will not forget you. We will be reviewing the chat questions, and we will have people here with mics to get your question from you, but wait until the very end. And then I will come back up, and I will moderate the questions, which means I will repeat each question for clarity, since this event is being recorded. So that is good news. In a week or so, you can come to the historicbostons.org website and see the recording of this event. So that's how it will unfold. We have so many things. You probably saw as you came in, our flyer with all the events for our fall series. There's some here, there are some out front. If you'd like to get on our mailing list, we'll take that out of the recording. We You have those sheets there as well. Oh, all right. Now, as to properly introducing David Hall, it is fitting that he asked me to give a very brief introduction because he is someone who does not rest on his laurels, though he could. David Hall is a professor emeritus of American religion at the Harvard Divinity School. And the shortest list of his works includes classics in the field, like Worlds of Wonder, Days of Judgment, Popular Religious Belief in Early New England, and Sarah's own copies of A Reforming People, Puritanism and the Transformation of Public Life in New England, and his latest book, The Puritans, A Transatlantic History, which brings us right up to the topic of this talk tonight. So please join me in welcoming David Hall.
Let me begin with a word of thanks, first to Sarah Stewart for inviting me to participate in this important series, and second to Laurie for that appropriately brief but generous introduction. I thank all of you who are here in person for attending, and those on Zoom as well. And I thank you because it's literally never been more important to understand the history of early New England, to understand how it was that colonial governments evolved as they did, because when we have that piece in place, we can understand why the revolution followed and what happened after that, long after that. So all of us know that history is not just a matter of facts, which we're sometimes overwhelmed with, but it's also a matter of interpretation of a narrative, a story that puts the facts together in some general manner. And although historians, I would freely admit that historians can disagree about the shape of that narrative, let me put my own cards clearly on the table. I do think the early history of New England mattered in what happened thereafter. And I hope to throw some light on that by traveling back across the Atlantic and looking at the England from which the colonists came, what they, as the phrase is in the title, what they left behind. So it's a kind of a threshold that I'm setting here tonight for understanding the kinds of decisions the colonists would make. I'm going to have to leave the story of those, actually all of those decisions were talked about in A Reforming People, but tonight I'm going to really focus on the English side. But at the very end, I hope to interrogate you or tantalize you or invite you to say that had you been on the Arbella or had you been on one of the ships coming later on in the 1630s, what would you have wanted to leave behind and start with afresh here in the free air of the New World, to quote the Scotsman Robert Bailey? So I've divided my remarks into three parts. My colleague Harvey Cox used to say, it has to be three parts and no more, or no less. I begin by describing how government worked in early Stuart England, both civil government and the government of the state church. And I glance briefly at the aristocracy and the gentry for their role in all that. So I'll be talking about kings and bishops. Then secondly, and in some ways of more importance, because the first part will be familiar to many of you, is the question of values. So values are the deep structure of every society, not so deep that they're necessarily hidden or disguised, but deep in the sense that even when they aren't openly voiced or openly apparent, they shape how we behave, how those behaved in the past. How people feel, it's what people feel they're morally obligated or socially obligated to do. The word culture may be useful here for all of us. What we may ask, and it's a question I want to linger on, what was the culture of authority in early 17th century England? And by the way, for any future historian, current historian who's listening, there's a great book to be written on the culture of authority in early New England. What moral rules or principles shaped governments, churches, and society? And then thirdly, given that historians are inclined to overemphasize homogeneity, or in retrospect, we're inclined to emphasize a culture or the culture, I want to have some fun by talking about the cracks and crevices in English culture in the early 17th century. When we look more closely at institutions, and this is superbly true of us in the good year 2024, when we look more closely at institutions or social practices, they often become strangely complex, semi-incoherent, in contradiction with each other, existing side by side with what seems like clarity and agreement, but then there's confusion. For example, if we were to look back at the court of James I or Charles I, we would say the court, what a homogeneous group that is. They're all sort of happy there sitting on top of the world. But we actually know it was beset by bitter, ambitious men trying to squeeze others out of any proximity to the king and gain power for themselves. It's a mess. It's a chaotic mess is what actually is true of the court of James I and Charles I. And I don't need to point out, by the way, that in terms of, I will point out that the history of the Puritan movement in England, its survival in England, in fact, its flourishing in England, when kings and bishops did their best to suppress it, is a gorgeous example of how what looks like homogeneity, what looks like the kind of a dominant culture, actually within it has room for lots of other kinds of culture. So 3 points, starting with kings. It feels like the overstatement of the year to remark that governance in England began and in a sense ended with the monarchy. Even so, it's worth reminding us who kings were. They were two things at once. They held the highest office in the land, an office defined by rules and precedents, some of them written, others unwritten, but also always articulated, at least for James and Charles, the two kings I'll mention here, by the principle that kings are by divine set up in an office that God himself has created. It's not some incidental thing that just popped up someday. It has a long history and a sacred history. So they're that kind of person who kind of step into an extraordinary role, but they're also people with their own quirks and temperaments, lots of quirks, lots of temperamental aspects to them. So all of you know something about the quirks of Henry VIII. Probably you know a fair amount about Elizabeth I, but because Elizabeth was childless, as were the two monarchs who preceded her, Mary Tudor and Edward VI. Mary Tudor died in the middle of her queenship, and Edward VI, who was only 16 when he died, brief kingship. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the crown descended to the only son of Mary Stuart, the Queen of Scots, executed in England in 1583, somewhat of a dubious lineage. So overnight, James VI of Scotland became James I of England. And James did have children, so that after his death in 1625, his son Charles became Charles I. We now have Charles III. Curious name, by the way, given the fact that Charles I was beheaded in 1649, an event, alas, that falls outside my chronological purview. So what was James VI and first like as a king? During the many years he was monarch of Scotland, and he was monarch from the age of about 18 months on in name, and then in reality when he was turned 18, he was not a very happy man a good deal of the time. Why not? Well, Scotland was basically run by a group of bandits known as the leaders of clans. And talk about a murderous people. They thought nothing of bopping each other off. Nothing. Bang! The Campbells hated they all hated each other. Sometimes religion got involved and sometimes not. Sometimes it was just personal grievances. So here was a seething mess of people who he had to work alongside of. They were the regents before he became king, before he reached his age, and then they were running his governments, and deep trouble all the time. Often they sometimes tried to grab the king and take him away and take him away from Edinburgh and make him the kind of prisoner. At any rate, the good news was that he outlived a lot of these people. And by his own steadiness, and he was a very bright man and policies, he gradually subdued most of these cults. The blood feud gradually, which is the name for how these clans regarded each other, gradually faded away, and order of a certain kind appeared in Scotland. So by the time he was coming down to England, he was in that sense a happy man. But he wasn't so happy from the day one, from when he first entered the crown, because there was another feisty group in Scotland, a very, very feisty group of ministers. So this takes us, in the briefest possible way, the Scottish Reformation, which dates from 1560, when a group of nobles and gentry and ministers summoned a rump parliament, and they turned Scotland from Catholic to Protestant overnight, despite the fact that the Queen Mary of Medici was there. She died rapidly shortly thereafter. That was good, she died, for the Protestants. And Mary Stuart, which she came over, was a weak queen. That was good as well. So unusually, the Protestant Reformation in Scotland thrived despite the opposition of the princely rulers of that country. And it thrived in some particular ways. It was very, very indebted to Calvin and to Calvinism and to Geneva, the example of Geneva. John Knox hailed it as the purest example of Christianity in anywhere, and then tried to make Scotland look like that also. And there were a couple of principles about that Church of Scotland as it came into being, as it still exists, for that matter. One was that there were not going to be any bishops. Way with bishops. There were bishops under the Catholic system. They were replaced by ministers, all of whom have the same rank, parity. A ministry is a parity, which is what, of course, the people here in New England adopted as well. All the ministers have exactly the same rank. No one is over another. Secondly, the church is run or ruled not by a monarch, but by a general assembly, which is representative of the local churches, the local synods and kirks. And that synod, that general assembly can pronounce on all kinds of matters, doctrine, church order. It can tell the king to his face, you're a jerk, you're messing around with the true church. And we know that I've told this story, but I'm not going to tell it tonight. I don't have time to tell it tonight. There's a marvelous episode where Andrew Melville takes the king by the shoulder and he says, James, you're a nobody. You're the servant of the church. You're the servant. And the king never spoke to James Melville again after that. At any rate, so the king is Charles. James does not take kindly to these rebukes, and he wrote about his thinking. He was, as I say, a very high, serious intellectual man. And he poured out a series of books, mostly advice books for his sons. And in these advice books, he says, these Puritans, that was his name, he appropriated that name from England, these Puritans cannot put up with any superiority, I'm quoting him now, which maketh their sect unable to be suffered in any well-governed commonwealth. In other words, when I come to England in 1603, I'm going to do everything I possibly can to push them away, push them down, and you should do the same thing. Beware of these people called Puritans. So when he crosses the river that separates Scotland and England, you can feel the sigh of relief in James. Oh, thank God I'm free of the kirk. Later on, by the way, he intervened from afar and insisted that they restore bishops in Scotland. The Scots got rid of that in the Revolution of 1638-39. So he's a happy man coming to England. No more clans, no more bishops, no more feisty ministers, no more people wanting to hold him accountable. Here, a kingship and he's crowned, and he becomes immediately the official head of the state church, a church, of course, that has bishops. Now, he was wise enough to know that he should hold out a small olive branch to those in England who were not high church royalists. So there were the Catholics, and he made it clear to the Catholics in England, small group, but a wealthy group, that he was not going to go after them in a serious way. And then he had a conference known as the Hampton Court Conference, met at the Palace of Hampton Court outside London. And there he brought together a few leading Puritans and some of the leading bishops to discuss, can we find a way forward? Can we compromise? Out of that came, of course, the King James Bible. One of the Puritans said, hey, how about a new translation of the Bible? Oh yeah, let's have a new translation of the Bible. And James liked a new translation of the Bible because it would mean there was no more marginalia of the kind that were in the Geneva Bible, which was the most reprinted Bible in England at that point in time. Anyway, KJV, we owe that in a sense to James I. But we also owe to him a famous statement that emerges out of the Hampton Court Conference. It's a very simple statement, 4-word statement: no bishop, no king. That's his summary of the benefit to the monarchy of having bishops. His son, by the way, in 1646, his only allies left in Britain are the Scots, who stupidly think they can persuade him to accept Presbyterianism as the real way of God. And Charles says, wait a minute, didn't my father once say, no bishop, no king? Oh, yeah, he did say that. So James acquired a more or less complacent church, with the exception of the Puritan faction, which I'll come back to. And then he acquired a parliament, which he'd had also in Scotland. And Parliament could be a sticky wicket. There was the House of Lords, containing bishops, by the way, and high-ranking aristocrats, and that was okay, pretty much going to do what he wants. And then the House of Commons, which in some sense was elected from towns and cities, and in some sense a representative body, and understanding itself, it had a self-understanding as the carrier of English liberties. It was the great defender of English rights and liberties, going back to Magna Carta. So the rule was that when the king needed money, and he needed a lot of money, James was always short of money, always wanting more money. He had to come to Parliament and ask for a grant of money, of taxes, really. He also had the power, of course, to veto any bill that the Parliament might pass. So on the one hand, he went hand in hand to Parliament. Please, time for me to cough up some money so I can, go to war, not go to war, run my castles, pay off my courtiers, whatever. Just keep the ship afloat. And Parliament could say to him, hey, we'll do it, but only if you kill a few more Catholics. Because the English Parliament and the English mood in general was that Catholicism was a very bad thing, and that Catholics should be punished as much as possible. And the king he didn't want that kind of a policy. So the alternative for him was not to have a parliament. And he had the exclusive right to summon parliaments and the right to dismiss a parliament if he didn't like what was happening. So he controls when parliaments meet and when they don't meet. And most of the time in his regime, it did not meet. And he writes to his son, Charles I, in one of his advice letters, have as few parliaments as possible. And the money problem persisted, but he could get around it by taxes and selling offices. And I mean, it's a very complex and, from our point of view, a very corrupt system, versus which we still have today. But I'm trying not to be too present-minded here, but there's a lot of present-mindedness to this story. And then let me just conclude with the church here, one more thing about the church. So James had established a reputation for himself in Scotland as, yes, hostile to the church, but very pro-Protestant. He was a Protestant. And he made that clear in various ways, famously by sending an English delegation to the Synod of Dort. This is beyond the scope of what you need to know, but an international synod of the Reformed churches met in the Netherlands in 1618. By the way, Anglicans in the Church of England today deny that the king sent a delegation to the Synod of Dort, because it's not in keeping with their understanding of the Church of England. But he did. You hear it from me, the horse's mouth. He did send a delegation to the Synod of Dort. At any rate, right about that time, he realized that he liked some bishops better than other bishops. He liked the bishops who were telling him, "O king, you're a glorious king. You're a great king. You're the best king ever. And it'd be even better if you were a little kinder to the Catholics. Kinder to the Catholics. I could be that. I could be that." His wife actually had converted to Catholicism. James's first wife had converted to Catholicism. And so he began to hang out with a group of bishops in the church, a small group at first and then larger, who felt that the reformers of 1558 or 1600 had made a mistake. They'd been too anti-Catholic, gone too far in making England Protestant. So let's bring back some Catholicism. Yeah, why not? What's wrong with it? It looks good. For example, let's restore the altars to their traditional position in a church. The altars had been moved down into the nave of the church. When I say altar, I mean a table. It's not an altar, it's a table around which you serve the Lord's Supper. Put it back at the top. Oh, okay, well, that sounds pretty good to me. Yeah, sure. And then these, let's call them high church bishops, or we can call them Laudians, after the most famous of them, William Laud, who became Archbishop of Canterbury. They also said, and King, you're of course owe your office to God and God alone, and Parliament is just sort of a, whatever, left over. Now, when Charles I became king in 1625, he agreed completely with this program and turned even more forcefully or warmly toward this one group of bishops, making Laud his Archbishop of Canterbury, endorsing their program 200%, including, and this is important chronologically, including their effort to do everything possible to crush the Puritan movement. Laud's ambition was to drive Puritanism out of the country, get rid of them, make it too difficult for them to continue. So, that's enough about kings and parliaments. And let me just say a word about the aristocracy and the gentry. These, of course, are people who inherit land. They're wealthy. They're the people who own land. Aristocracy claiming their own privileges, jealous of each other like crazy, like the clans in Scotland, only they don't kill each other off, like in Scotland. And so they're a tremendously powerful group. They're the king's advisors. Here's officers. And they like being, very much they like being on top. They're on top, just below the king, but they're sort of on top. Now to moral rules. There are a lot of moral rules floating around Stuart England, some of them borrowed from the Old Testament, others from the New, others emerging out of circumstances like the long legacy of the common law. But all roads, wherever they came from, wherever advice came from, moral rules came from, all roads led to the importance of authority. And the moralists who extolled authority painted a very dark picture of what life would be like, social life would be like, without clear sense of who was the head. Think of a headless body staggering around, without a sense of direction, morally and mentally off the rails. Worse, women on top instead of men. And I mean that figuratively, not literally. Decline taking place, irreversible decline occurring as disorder spread, and all kinds of disorder, masterless men, irrelevant women, Satan flourishing and seducing people to become witches and do all kinds of other bad things, and idleness and covetous and sexuality evident in children born out of marriage. And there was a whole category of people who were like Chicken Littles. Do you all know the story of Chicken Little? It's kind of a forgotten story. As I was driving in, I was remembering Chicken Little, Chicken Little. Anyway, whole series of people, Chicken Little, the sky is falling, and cheap writers, pamphleteers would publish stories of wonders, miraculous, semi-miraculous supernatural events, storms, strange things happening in nature, deformed, monstrous births. We had one here in Boston of Anne Hutchinson and Mary Dyer, monster births. And these were portents that God was angry because things were declining so bad. So there was a lot of rhetoric, on the one hand, how wonderful authority was, matched by amount of rhetoric about how little order there was, and therefore how authority should be strengthened. You know, do your job. Do your job, constable. Do your job, aristocrat. Do your job, king. Suppress the disorder. So there's a good society, a health society, and the church weighs in here in saying that you can't take Holy Communion unless you're at peace with your neighbors. A lot of literature about families and how children should be raised and wives should be subordinate and so forth and so on. And then, of course, it all comes back to having leaders. And it all comes back as well to a very negative word. And that word is democracy. It, of course, is a Greek word in its origins. But in early 17th century England, democracy meant really one thing: no leadership. Everybody of the same rights, the same capacities, running around like, you know, putting out chaos. A democracy would be chaos. Don't want to have anything like it. And we have a marvelous example from 1636, and I turn back to New England, where a member of the English aristocracy, Lord Say and Seal, wrote John Winthrop, said, you know, I'm thinking about coming over to Massachusetts. I'd like to come to Massachusetts. I'd like to get out of England because I'm a Puritan and I'm not doing so well over here. But if I came over, can you guarantee me the same rights and privileges I had in England? So that, for example, I hear that only church members can be freemen, can be elected. Could you just waive that for me and automatically qualify me for governance? Do any of you know what John Cotton was delegated to write him back? Anybody know what John Cotton said back to him? John Cotton wrote back a marvelously evasive letter. He's a master at writing evasive letters. And that's why Winthrop chose him to write back. You say, well, democracy over here, we don't use that word. We understand that word is, kind of means confusion. But I'm sorry to tell you, the answer is no. We are not waiving our rules. If you arrive here, you will have to abide by exactly the same rules. And guess what decision Lord Say and Seal made? I'm staying here. I'm staying back in England. So one other, now I want to come to cracks and contradictions in the system. So in England, this is the fun part. In England, you couldn't criticize the king. If you did, it was treason, and you could be executed or imprisoned. No book can be published without being authorized through the Stationers' Company through a system of licenses. There's no freedom of speech. There's no concept of toleration, except in terms of what the king or the bishops might look the other way in certain cases, like with Catholics. So, cracks and contradictions. Underneath this ethos of order and control of thought, there's an amazing amount of contradictory information floating around. Gossip, no rules coming out of the court can control gossip. There are illicit publications off the length of your arm, illicit publications coming in mostly from the Netherlands. Printers in the Netherlands publish, and they're smuggled into England and distributed in an amazingly wide way. People read these. The handwritten texts, they're technically called scribal publication, were beneath the radar of the censors of the printed book because they were not printed books, and these circulate in remarkable quantities. So what might have been secret or semi-secret by the court is actually known to everybody, almost everybody. not the very ordinary people, but to the curious class, and especially known in London. Suppress the Puritans. So there's a wonderful anecdote about William Laud. He comes into office as Archbishop and he says to one of his aides, give me a count of how many parishes I can appoint ministers to. You know, I want to get a grip on this church and shape it up. And somebody comes back and says, well, there's 8,500 parishes in England, and 4,000 of the appointments are controlled by aristocrats, and you have no authority to intervene in at all. And you can imagine the headache Laud got at that point in time. I'm going to fail at the job of controlling the Church of England because half of the ministers are immune from my authority. So the English system looks top down from one perspective, but if we look locally, look at towns and villages and even at parishes within London, we see a completely different picture. We see people doing what they feel they want to be doing. They want a Puritan minister, they get a Puritan minister. In London itself, John Davenport, the future founder of New Haven, is installed in the early 1620s in a church, very famous church, and they can't do anything about it. Boston, England, who came up earlier in Bob Ellison's opening remarks, Boston, England, John Cotton is installed in 1612. And the question comes down from his bishop, there's some rumor that John Cotton is not doing all the rituals that we want him to be doing. The church wardens write back, oh no, he is the perfect example of an ideal clergyman. They cover up for him. This happens in town after town after town. There's no police force that can be sent out. There's no FBI. There's no inquisitors that can go out into all these little villages and towns everywhere and look into these things. The central authority is really dependent upon local informants, and the local informants are quite willing in many, many, many cases to cover up the reality and say, hey, we got a really good guy here, and he's doing just fine, and don't bother us. And there are many other ways in which local people are privileged their own mores. Here's a small example, but it's an important example. A young girl gets pregnant out of marriage. All right, what's better? Do we report her to the church courts and she gets punished, seriously punished? Or do we know that a year or two from now she's going to marry her boyfriend, which is 60% of the cases that happens. That's what happens in most of the cases. She marries the boyfriend. What's the better thing to do? Turn that family upside down or look ahead to a kind of communal common sense? And again and again and again, it's the communal common sense that prevails. So there's an astonishing series of subcultures in England. And there's one of these I want to emphasize here by way of a conclusion on this part of the talk. And that's the creativity of the king's enemies, primarily Puritans, but also people bothered by his disdain for Parliament. This is James, but now especially Charles. And they say about 1620, 21, they began to say, I think I see signs of a popish plot. I see signs of a popish plot emerging. And John Pym, who becomes very, very famous in the early 1640s as the leader of the House of Commons, is one of the first to say this. And nobody pays much attention to him in 1621, but a few years later, oh yeah, that makes a kind of sense. It makes kind of sense of what James is doing and now Charles is doing. He's ignoring Parliament. That's a Catholic thing, a pro-Catholic thing. He's turning the Church of England over to a pro-Catholic group. And so the noise gets louder and louder, the popish plot. There's a marvelous moment when the king, James I, decided that he wants to have his son, Charles, marry a Spanish princess who's a Catholic. It's called the Spanish match. And news comes that it's broken off. And bonfires are lit all over England, celebrating the fact that the king is not marrying a Spanish Catholic. He actually ends up marrying a French Catholic. But, so it's not such a happy story in the long run. But the popish plot. Now, the surest way to validate the reality of a popish plot, the surest way to validate it is to test to the fullest the boundaries of the official system. Push back as far as you can go to show how tyrannical the official system is tending to become. And in English history, there's a great example of this, going back to the 1550s, when Mary Tudor tried to restore Catholicism as the official religion in England. And that's the 300 people who became martyrs, who died at the stake, burned to death at the stake for their faith. And they become a kind of historical memory, much reiterated over time, of what do you do when you're faced with utter evil. You have to be willing to die for your faith, and then the wheel will, this is a theological argument, the wheel will then turn. God will hear those of you who are truly the faithful. You understand the argument? The shape of this, it's a ritual process. I mean, does it feel like to die isn't such a great ritual process, but in any case, that's what it is. It presumes, if I am faithful, God will hear us and the tyrant will fall, eventually. So there's a marvelous moment in English history in July of 1637 when three men stand on a scaffold in London. One has his second ear cut off, his forehead branded, and otherwise he's cruelly wounded. The other two men have their first ear cut off, and they're also wounded in various ways. Prynne, Bastwick, and Burton. The bishop is there, Laud is there to pronounce various reasons why they're being treated. They've published illicit texts that condemn the king and Charles and his policies and condemn the church. So they're evil. They deserve to be punished. They really should be executed. But we're told, and we know this from a letter written to John Winthrop by an English friend who was there. He said there were 5,000 people there, cheering the courage of these people to endure this punishment, cheering them on, celebrating their courage as they were tortured. And then we know from other letters that as the three men were sent out to various prisons, each to a different prison, but people had already on the scaffold rushed forward to soak rags in the blood that fell from their ears or other parts of their body, and to save these as relics. That's what you need when you have a martyr. You need a relic of the martyr to serve as your reminder of their faith. So let's put things together. You're the king, you're Charles I, you're by the way, he hasn't had a parliament in 8 years. Not gonna have another one for another 2 more years. Sort of on top of the world, thinks he's on top of the world. And we can feel the cracks emerging in his authority. The moral power of the example of these three men, felt here in New England, felt here this far away, is going to be like the fuse that lights a fire that will explode on Charles I in 1639, 1640. So let me just come back again to the Puritans here for a moment. So the Puritans, they're not one thing. They're moderate Puritans. There's off-the-wall Puritans, whatever, all kinds of Puritans. And when they finally had the freedom to do whatever they wanted to, boy, did all sorts of stuff break out. And it broke out here in Massachusetts with the Antinomians. So we have to be careful when we use the word Puritan to put a kind of asterisk by it, because it can mean different kinds of people. And we don't want to paint them as disloyal. They were not Republicans in the sense of in the 17th century, meaning want to get rid of the monarchy. That's not who they were. Monarchy was okay. They certainly wanted to get rid of bishops, and they certainly wanted a different kind of church structure, and they certainly wanted a set of moral rules that they regarded as in keeping with the structure of the Bible as seen through the lens of a strict Protestant theology. And there's one more thing they brought over with them in terms of values. Very, very important. We see it in this, probably the most famous text from the 17th century, John Winthrop's so-called charity discourse of 1630, not preached on the Arbella, read rather earlier. And in that, he embraces the concept of covenant. We're all in covenant together, and we're going to this new world, and we're going to be bound together by a covenant. And what is the principle of this covenant? It's love each other. He evokes the great passages in Matthew and elsewhere where Jesus says, love is the primary commandment. Or he evokes, without explicitly mentioning it, 1 John 3:14. Love of the brethren is what is demanded of those who are truly the allies, the servants, the believers in Christ. Love of the brethren. And what does it mean to have love? What does it mean to be in covenant? And Winthrop knows, he knows because there's so many stories of Jamestown and the horrors of Jamestown where it almost became cannibalistic and authority collapsed and complete disorder reigned. And he knew about other colonies where disorder had happened. And we're not going to have that here in Massachusetts. Why? We're not going to have that here, or I hope, because we're going to be a people of love. And when we see someone in need in our community, our love will mean we'll take care of that person. Specifically, he says, if someone comes to you and wants money, he has run out of money here, give them the money. And don't charge interest on the money. You want them to repay it, but don't charge interest on it. So Winthrop sketched a model of society, of culture, that really would have been seen as bizarre in a king-run England, where all the authority comes from top down, and everything is skewed towards sustaining that authority and the authority of the state church. But here, truly, it'll be a world turned upside down. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Covered so much in that engaging, wonderful talk. So now, time for questions. And I think we will start in the room with our mics, our mic runners.
Hello? There we go. Thank you for your talk. You mentioned, was it a number of congregations that were not under laud? 4,000, I think you said. This is kind of a two-part question. Did those, as congregations, did they collaborate or quarrel? And did people leave communities under laud to get away from laud, or did people leave the communities not under the laud and go to those other communities for maybe some order?
So I didn't take the time to say why 4,000 parishes were not under his control. It's because people of means bought what were known as livings, which is the right to the tithes of a given parish. In England, tithing is mandatory. People are obligated to pay tithes to the state church. But so if I were Lord Say and Seal, Lord Say and Seal did own livings. And so sadly, of course, the money coming from the tithes sometimes went into his pocket rather than into the church. So, and this was a system that goes way back when the Reformation began in England. One of the ways for the king to make money was to sell these livings off. It's a corrupt system, totally corrupt, totally corrupt. Believe me, in Scotland, it was worse. any case, your question is about how that might affect who came to the New World and who didn't. And I don't actually have figures in my head that answer that question. So, but certainly people came from parishes that had a certain degree of autonomy, as well as from parishes that did not. I don't know that there would be a sharp, simple way of quantifying that. Primarily it's southeastern England from which most of the early migrants come. And that had been since the 1560s, a strongly Protestant part of the country, less bishop-centered than other parts of the country were. So that's the one thing I will say here. More voluntary religion, we might say, in that part of England than elsewhere. That's about as far as I can go and give you a specific answer. I mean, we could go by minister, by minister, by minister, by minister, and I could do that to a certain extent before I read. But I don't think you want that, no.
So in the U.S., I've been studying church history for a while, and in the U.S., after, not until 1648, so it's sort of after the period we're covering here by a little bit, but John Cotton's still involved. The Cambridge Platform was put together, which was an agreement among all the churches.
It's written on my chest.
So the question is, did the English churches share anything written or any covenant between the churches? Because part of the platform is how the churches deal with each other.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I wonder if that happened
That's an excellent question.
among
So
independent churches.
when the so-called Puritan Revolution begins in England in 1641, a group of people who are sympathetic to the congregational system emerge in England. And they're a little nervous about their opposite selves in Massachusetts because they think they're maybe gone a little too far. But over time, there's a rapprochement. So, but the Cambridge Platform per se never has any influence in England at all. None, zero. But they write their own. They write their own platforms after a while. There are about 250 congregations in England by the mid 1650s. So quite a few, more of course than in New England. So, but again, it's a terrific question. It's like the question about authority, how these two transatlantic versions got along with each other. And Frank Bremer has written an excellent book on some aspects of that question. Yes.
Which is, so thinking about the political writing that is like everywhere at this time, the Petition of Right, Henry Parker, John Milton, all these people siding with Parliament's rights and individual rights against arbitrary government and the monarch. So how much did this political writing affect the thinking of the Puritans who came here? Because all these writings are against the tyranny of the king.
It's a terrific question. So let me just repeat it in my own way. So once freedom of the press happens circumstantially in England as of 1641, 42, 43, when nobody will enforce the stationer's company can't enforce anything any longer. It's a explosive publishing, fantastic publishing situation for anybody who wants to publish. A lot of stuff comes out about what good government looks like that is not royalist at all in its approach. It's parliamentarian, it's rights, liberties focused. And so you ask a truly terrific question because you might think this literature would have influenced the colonists. The answer is the colonists had already gotten there. In practice, they had already gotten there. So I don't know of anyone in the colonies who reads Milton's 3 tracts or later tracts. There probably maybe been some, but I don't know of anybody who actually did cites them and says, hey, I've read, come on, hey, buddy, I've read John Milton. Henry Parker, the same thing. I don't know of anyone who cites Henry Parker, who in English political thought, as the ball gets rolling there at the beginning of the 1640s, he is a somebody getting the ball rolling. in rethinking government, but and rethinking what the word Puritan means. But I don't know anyone who cites him. It's a curious, very curious thing to see on this side of the Atlantic such dramatic change occurring, and yet there's almost no formal statement of goals. We have to infer that from actions. And then there's Winthrop, who's a little sour from time to time. It's going too fast. It's, I'm losing authority too fast. He's like a moody James I at times, not all the time, some of the time. But otherwise, salt and stall, get rid of the council, people of Watertown, stop taxing us without our permission. I mean, these amazing things happen, bang, 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 like that. And
The first time
and
there's
then
a
the most amazing,
protest
I'm sorry,
about-
the most amazing thing of all is that Winthrop assumes he's going to be governor. Bang, he's turned out of office in 1634. Rotation in office, never heard of that, rotation in office. Never heard of it, not in England, don't have it in England. Once you're in, it's an oligarchical system. Turned out of office. And when the people go to Connecticut to establish the government there, they write it into the fundamental orders of Connecticut. No governor can succeed himself the next year. Phenomenal, phenomenal step. But we don't have anybody, we have no theoretical statements about this at all. All we have to go by is how angry they were about the English system. They really wanted to leave it behind and do something better. Plus, they were more or less of an even social rank. They were of a common social rank, so that helped too.
But, sorry, follow-up question. So just one thing, isn't it 1633 when Watertown says we want representation or we're not going to pay our
right, yeah.
But the sentiments carried by the values carried by the Puritans when they came over here, which predate Henry Parker and so forth,
Right.
aren't those the same sentiments that inform a lot of what leads to the Civil War? Or is that
Well,
over-
the civil, okay, so now we're in deep water here, deep water, because no two historians of Britain, and I am not an historian of Britain technically, can agree on what caused the Civil War. So, so one thing is Charles I's missteps, misread the situation completely. There's John Pym in running the the Congress and doing a fantastic job of radicalizing it. But at any rate, so, we could say that the group that says Parliament is in jeopardy by the king's attitude, is that a Puritan position or is that a deep common law position? Which way would we go? I see a man nodding his head behind me. Common law is what you're arguing for, rather than Puritan. So this is where the overlap is interesting, because there's certainly people in Parliament who are not Puritans who are going to protest Charles I's policies. So in terms of, even the regicide is not the Presbyterians in England, who are by far the largest group of Puritans, they are bitterly opposed to the regicide, to the execution of Charles I. They think it's going to be cause trouble, and it does cause trouble. More trouble than it's worth.
So I'm doing some of the questions from Zoom, since I've been moderating it here on my iPad. There was a robust discussion early on in your talk on the Zoom chat. Folks who are familiar with Zoom know that chat always has great things going on. Discussing what was the major reason why many of the people left for here to come over from England to here in the North America, both colonies in general, but also specifically Mass Bay. Propaganda, one person was saying, was that they left for religious reasons, but didn't many of them actually come over for economic reasons? And then I'm going to throw in on that, does economic reasons and religious reasons need to be necessarily sort of separate and not involved, not involved in a decision?
Well, it's a little like the Civil War, the causes of the Civil War. There are historians who say economic, religion. So the short answer is that by the 1630s, if you could get to Virginia, survive the climate, I'm a native Virginian, by the way, get to Virginia, survive the climate, worse then than it is now, down in James River, and get some tobacco in the ground, you're going to make a lot of money for a short while, a lot of money. The people who came to Massachusetts knew, and they knew for the second time when they arrived, there was no staple crop here of any value in England at all. Nothing that we could sell to the English. So very rapidly, they ran out of their capital here. And what saved them was the development of the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, which desperately needed wood, food, certain kinds, dried fish for their slaves to eat, so forth and so on. So by the mid-1640s, there's been an economic depression in New England. Prosperity is coming. The prosperity that will lead to a boom in shipbuilding, because also they can't build ships down, there's no wood for building ships. So, but there's another answer to your question, and that involves owning land. So, do all of you know this? Every householder who came to Massachusetts and Connecticut got a grant of land free of rents. It's your own land. Nobody in England of their status owns land free of rents. Now, no one has put on paper that I know of the time, yippee. Mm-hmm. But we can feel it in the security they feel about having children. They're going to have property to pass on to their children, the large families they start having. That's out of a sense of economic, it looks good downstream. You know what I mean? I can pass something on to my children. But going back to but the initial question is, coming to Massachusetts, if you're a fisherman off I also have roots in Maine. If you were a fisherman off Monhegan, but these people aren't fishermen. They don't know how to fish. They wouldn't like to fish. They would want to go fishing. Buy their fish from the fishermen. They don't want to go fishing. They made money. But and then the fur trade was minuscule in New England in southern New England compared to what had happened in Canada, where people made fortunes off the fur trade. So on to the next question.
So actually, I'll follow up on that one because I realized I did a little bit of a disservice to the initial question. Was also wondering, were people coming over, again, purely for economic reasons and not because of political reasons? So let's throw it, were politics ever separate from religion?
We have to put in that people brought over servants. There was a servant class hired in England to come here because if you were John Winthrop, you didn't want to be out there scrubbing your floors or doing your cooking, nor did Mrs. Winthrop. So you had servants, and there's a fairly large servant class, and Winthrop's journal is full of references to servants who misbehaved, ran away, had sex with another servant, whatever, So the servants, there's very little scholarship done on the servants, but they, of course, don't stay servants all their lives. It's a term of service. So those people came maybe hoping for a better way of life.
And another person was asking, saying they'd be interested in knowing what aspects of English Puritanism the Boston-bound Puritans desired to leave behind. Was there any aspects of Puritanism in England that was like, nope, we're not going to do that?
That's a terrific question. And the surest answer would be to bring in Scotland. So the Scottish Puritan system set up what were known as the Kirk Sessions, which are lay-run disciplinary courts. And if the hypothetical young girl who's been caught pregnant is brought before the Kirk, there's a stool called the shaming stool that she has to sit on for 3 weeks in front of the entire congregation to shame her for her misdeed. And no congregation in New England does that kind of shaming, public shaming, and nobody adopts the Kirk Sessions. There are certainly cases of young girls getting pregnant and the church being, not so great thing. But They do not adopt the hardcore Scottish system of discipline. It's quite striking.
Really interesting. As a specialist in Scotland, yeah, I shouldn't go on about Scottish Presbyterianism, but yeah. Another person asking, how do you square Winthrop's ideas about charity with that colonial practice of warning people out who are likely to become public charges?
Warning them out.
Warning them out meaning, and I'm guessing that means, I know in England it was sort of, I don't know the term warning out, but driving people out who are likely to become public charges.
Can I revert to my assumption about contradictions?
Yeah.
So any appeal to charity, Winthrop's or anyone else's, is probably somewhere down the road going to have a catch clause in it. So that's all I would say to that. You know, we can't accuse him of being hypocrite. All we can say is that's the way the world works.
There's an interesting conversation going on in chat about replacing the tyranny of kings with the tyranny of your neighbors. Yeah.
Question at this point on that, which is when the Puritans came here with their charter, they were given the one rule not to make any laws repugnant to the laws of England. And they did, as David's been telling us, you know, they did a lot of things very differently. And they were, you know, they may have left the ideas behind, but they were still always alert to the possibility that the English government, the king, since the Parliament wasn't meeting, might send some people over to break the whole thing up. And so if you could just talk about, you know, that tension of we're going to do things our own way. We don't want anyone to know we're doing that. Exactly.
Yeah, no, where is she? I want to go back to the, remind me what you were just saying.
I was talking about replacing the tyranny of kings with the tyranny of neighbors, and also the warning out.
I'm going to tell you something that's very heartwarming. So I've written about it in the last chapter of A Reforming People. It's a study of Cambridge, Massachusetts. So by 1639, there were a lot of people in Cambridge, Massachusetts who were sinking into poverty because they'd gone through all their money and no one yet knew where they were going to more money coming in. So Shepherd says, let's create a charity fund here in the town. And if you've got a spare cow, contribute your cow. And I'll put in some money. And people do. And they create a charity fund. And the record of it survives, of the early gifts that were made and the early distributions that were made from this fund. So if somebody has an ill relative and needs somebody else to help out, here's not a check, but here's something to help out with. And so it's the only example I know of a village that does so specifically create a fallback welfare system for those who are unable to, who are not doing well. And then, of course, prosperity eventually comes around, so they don't have to worry about it so much anymore. But it's there as a possibility, at least. So let me go back to the question, Laurie, that you were wrestling with here. I've got to repeat the question.
So the Puritans who came here left a lot of things they didn't like behind in England, but they were given the charge not to make any laws repugnant to the laws of England.
Yeah, so, sorry. Yeah, I came back with you. So, yes, and in fact, 1635, so the remarkable thing about the Massachusetts Bay Company, to which Charles I had given a charter, it's remarkable that he gave the charter, still a mystery why he gave the charter. Was it corrupt or whatever? Maybe you never saw the piece of paperwork. I used to be head of a department at Harvard, and you wanted the dean to know some things and not know other things. So maybe the king didn't know. At any rate, so the charters enabled them to move the governorship to Massachusetts, and they bring the literal physical charter with them. It's in the State House to this day. So then 1635, Laud says, remember these crazy guys over there? Let's look at their charter. We can't find the charter. We can't find it. Where is the charter? And so they write a letter, send us back the charter. You know, it's a royal charter, send it back. And what did the colonists do? No, we're not sending it back. We're not sending it back. And then the rumor comes, they hear, that Lord is going to appoint, or King is going to appoint a governor general to come back over and rule with them. And they built a little fort out in Boston Harbor, hopeless fort. Nobody wanted to be out there in the harbor building this fort, but they built it. And then the Civil War begins, and then everything collapses for Charles I in England. But then in 1660, after the restoration of Charles II, all this process begins again. And in 1684, the charter is revoked legally in England. So it's an interesting question. And there's a longer story to tell, a much longer story to tell about the colonists. I'll give you an example. Can I give you one example here? So in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a printing press is set up to print the Bible in Algonquin. Do you all know this? No? It's the first project in English to actually create a written version of a native oral language, turn Algonquin into a written language, and then print the entire Bible right there in Harvard Yard. So then, and it's printed because of money donated by friends in England. So there's a big debate in the general court. It's all in the records. Maybe we should dedicate this to Charles II. Charles II, holy moly's. Well, the printer comes to them and says, well, I can run up 5 copies with a dedication to Charles II, and we can dedicate the rest to Robert Boyle, who had provided the money for the project. So we have, this is too delicious. We have a letter from Robert Boyle back to Massachusetts. Oh, I took a copy to the king, and he opened it up, and he saw, oh, it's dedicated to me. And the king never knew that there were like 1,000 other copies without that dedication to him. So it's a history of camouflage, of deceptions, of half-truths, back and forth across the Atlantic. It's a marvelous story, just, by the way, recently told by Adrienne Weimer in her book on the 1660s Constitutional Compact.
Yeah, so my question is, when is that defining point where the Puritans are making their plans to come here to the New World? What is that defining point where they decide that they are going to create this entire new system to govern themselves by?
The question, in a sense, is about trigger. What was the trigger? So here's an important point. The great majority of Puritans didn't come. It's only a small subset of people who came. And they almost always come as family groups, clusters of people. Not so much as, so the Dorchester Company founds Dorchester. Thomas Hooker and his friends are the founders of Cambridge, or Newtown, Cambridge. And there's a wonderful book by Roger Thompson, the British historian, on the structures of the migrations. They come not as, I'm buying a ticket to go to New England. I'm finding other people to go with. So it's the kind of random, semi-randomness of in your part of Sussex or Essex or out in the West, Dorchester, are there enough people making noises about going there? And then what's the trigger that gets them to go? And probably, I'm just a riff here. There are 3 or 4 wealthy merchants or wealthy townspeople who say, I'll help make this, I'll rent the ship and make it possible. That's probably what it is. But I just want to say again, the great majority of Puritans don't come. And we have, diaries in which people, so I from 1630s when relatives of people have come and they say, come on over, and I like it here. And then did you know that half of the Harvard graduating classes in the 1640s went back to England? Because the jobs were better there than they were in New England, paid better. So what we're lucky, if we want to watch New England develop, what we're lucky is that the demographic situation was so extraordinarily favorable. Now in London, the chances were that if you had a baby, it was going to die because the water is totally polluted and there's plague and everything. You come here, the water is pure. It's the first time in any of these people's lives they have had an unpolluted water system. Just think of the benefit of that. So you have all these kids And a great majority of them survive into adulthood, and then they have kids. So the population growth and a local growth, not a migrant growth, but a local growth, is phenomenal. From 15,000 people or so in 20,000 by 1640, you have 100,000 in 1700. It's an extraordinary thing. So that's why it looks so impressive, but actually it starts out as very selective, very, very random, very ad hoc who comes over. And it would require a micro-histories of a whole series of decisions to trace these out. I've given you a ballpark answer. You didn't want to go by yourself. You wanted to go with other people.
I'm going to ask some more questions from the chat, that's why. So, and I'll repeat it into the mic. Say it and I'll repeat it. So what he's saying is, he's clarifying the person who asked the question, that it's not so much the decision to come to the new world that you are asking on, but when did people make the
It's
decision to
timing, the
break
timing
from
of
the
it.
system?
Yeah, well, that we can answer. Because roughly 800 people came over in 1630, about a third of them went back, unhappy for good reason, what they saw. The weather was terrible, whatever. And then the Laudian agenda and the realizing that there wasn't going to be a parliament for who knows how long really begins to sink in about 1634, 35, 36. And that's when we see lots of ships coming over, lots of people leaving. It's a combination of political and religious circumstances that looks as though it's going to be hopeless in England, that nothing's going to change the king. There's no way to dislodge him, no way to change his policies. It's set in place. So it does accelerate, and then it comes to an abrupt end once the Puritan Revolution begins in England. Nobody wants to come over after that point. So we know, to go back to your question, the trigger is the persistence, intensifying of the Laudian policies and Charles's policies. The day that they're no longer able to enforce those policies is the day that migration stops. Stops cold. Nobody comes over.
And another question from the chat, another of the broad questions. To what extent was the print revolution started by Gutenberg in 1455 a factor in Puritan discontent with English politics? And I'm going to throw in a comment, a thought from what you had said earlier about they had the official, sort of the approved printing, but they also had so much script writing and pamphlets coming in from abroad, which strike me rather like social media flooding the country. So how much did that print revolution influence things?
It's a terrific question, and of course, the deeper question is famous question that is about the Protestant Reformation. Would it have happened without the printing press? Anybody want to speculate on an answer to that question? So this is a subsidiary question to that, and so I'll say this, two things. One is the Puritans knew they wanted a printing press as soon as they got here. And they set one up in 1638 in Harvard Yard. This is before the one for the Bible. And this is astonishing. I mean, it's astonishing. They did this so early. I should say the Spanish had one in Mexico City a century before, but nonetheless, it's astonishing. You don't have one in Virginia till the end of the 17th century. Sorry to say that about my Virginia ancestors here. Ignorant, poor white trash. At any rate, that's not true, but anyway, that's so. And it's also the case that these people, Cotton, Shepherd, Hooker, Davenport, others, had published prolifically in England because the Puritans there was a certain genre of devotional book. This is how you are a good Christian. Read this book and it'll give you the map to becoming a good Christian. And they soaked this stuff up. I mean, there was a big market in this stuff. So they brought over a lot of books of that kind. And they kept on writing them while they were here. And when John Eliot, the great missionary to the Indians, decided he wanted to print devotional books alongside the Bible, these are the books he printed. One book by Shepherd, book by two famous English Puritans. So the books did matter a good deal to these people. And the literacy rate was high. By the way, high for women as well as for men. It's very interesting I worked on this for a while, worked it out pretty clearly. So literacy, liking books. By the way, I was going to tell a story that I get to tell now. I cut it out of my talk. So talking about what you leave behind and what you bring over. So they bring over books. And one day John Winther remembers that he had brought a Bible with him. He hadn't used it for a while, and he goes to the closet or wherever it was, and with it was bound the Book of Common Prayer. This was very common in England that you would bind a devotional book with the Bible. So here he is, and he'd kind of forgotten he owned this book. And he goes to the closet, and he opens it up. Here's my Bible, and wait a minute, the rats have gotten this book. Oh, they've only eaten the Book of Common Prayer. It's providential. It's providential. The Bible is intact. The Book of Common Prayer has been nibbled away. So he didn't have to worry any longer about having this bad book in his library. Are we running? I'm running out of energy. Are you running out? I think we're running out of time. Yeah.
We've come to the end of our questions and our time. Well, we have not come to the end of our questions, but we have come to the end of our time. I'm sure we're all going to go home thinking a lot about these people who we call the Puritans. And thanks so much once again to David Hall for his time.
Thank you for your patience, and I thank you for these terrific questions you've asked. It's forced me to think about a lot of things, and I'm very, very grateful to all of you online or here in person for being here.
And remember, you can come right down here, or I think still outside, look at the next talks that we have coming up in person and online to keep the conversation going. Thank you so much to everyone who's here with us tonight. Good night.